Teddy Vane's hand closed around Nell Whitaker's wrist before she could step past him, and the silver tray in her hands tipped 12 crystal glasses fell and shattered across the marble floor of the brightly lit ballroom at Ravenscliff. 40 guests in evening dress turned to look. Then, one by one, they turned away. That hand still had not let go. It pressed down, forcing the housemaid to kneel among the broken glass and gather the pieces with her bare hands, while the laughter and the clinking of glasses went on directly above her head. Nell did not cry out. She did not pull her arm free. She lifted her head only once, and met the eyes of the man standing silently at the top of the staircase. Not one person in that room knew that the woman in the gray uniform kneeling on the floor was not truly a servant, or that the worn silver locket at her throat held a secret powerful enough to bring down the 3 wealthiest families in Boston. And no one knew that the man on the staircase, the owner of this estate, had just quietly memorized the name of every single person who had turned away. If this story touched your heart, leave a like, share it with someone who comes to mind, drop a comment below, and subscribe to our channel for the stories still to come. The marble floor was gleaming clean by the time the last guests left Ravenscliff. Nell stood alone in the middle of the empty ballroom, a mop in her hands, watching the golden light from the crystal chandelier spill across the polished stone. In that silence, the house sounded entirely different. The click of heels, the laughter, the music had all drained away, leaving only the slow drip of water into the bucket and the sound of her own breathing. She pulled her sleeve down over her wrist, covering the red marks that were already beginning to darken into a faint purple. She didn't look at them. She had learned that some things hurt more the longer you looked at them, and tonight, she still had 3 floors to clean before dawn. Bernadette Kroll appeared in the doorway, the assignment ledger tucked against her chest, her silver hair twisted into a neat bun without a single strand out of place. She stood there for a while, watching Nell work, before she finally spoke, her voice as calm as if she were reminding her about the schedule for washing table linens. "You won't write anything in the incident log about tonight." Nell stopped moving the mop. "I wasn't planning to, ma'am." "Good, because if you write it down, I'll have to submit it. And if I submit it, people will ask why a maid who's been working here for less than 2 months broke 12 glasses during an important party." She didn't raise her voice. There was no sarcasm in it at all, and that was exactly what made the words colder than any shout could have been. "I didn't break them." Bernadette nodded slowly, as though Nell had said something that was true but meaningless. "I know." She stepped closer and lowered the ledger. "I've stood inside houses like this longer than you've been alive. I've watched plenty of young women believe the truth carries weight of its own. Then I watched them walk out the back door with a cardboard box in their hands, and the men who made them cry were still sitting inside, still having their drinks poured, still being addressed by name." She placed a hand on Nell's shoulder, a brief touch that wasn't gentle, but wasn't cruel either. "In this house, the people below are never right. That's not a rule I made. It was here before I arrived, and it'll still be here after I'm gone." Nell looked at her, and what sent a chill down her spine wasn't the cruelty, it was the exhaustion. The woman's voice sounded like someone who had surrendered a very long time ago and had learned to live peacefully with that surrender. "Yes, ma'am." Bernadette nodded, satisfied, then turned away. At the doorway, she paused for a moment without looking back. "Put ice on your wrist before you sleep. Otherwise, you won't be able to hold a tray tomorrow morning." Then she was gone. Nell carried the bucket of water into the hallway, and that was when she saw him. In the corner of the foyer, beneath the only wall lamp still burning, a middle-aged man remained seated on a velvet chair, his back straight, his legs held close together. His gray suit was wrinkled at the elbows and knees, the kind of wrinkles cheap fabric took on after someone had been sitting for far too long. In his hands was a felt hat, and he kept turning it, over and over, one circle after another, as though something terrible might happen if he stopped. Nell recognized him. He had been sitting in that exact spot when she carried the first tray of drinks out of the kitchen in the late afternoon. He had sat there through the entire party, through the music, through the breaking glass, through the moment when the whole room had erupted in laughter. He hadn't been invited inside. He hadn't gotten up to ask anyone anything. He had simply sat there and waited. Footsteps sounded on the staircase. Rafe Santoro came down wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up at the wrists, a stack of papers in one hand. He didn't look around. He didn't greet anyone. The man in the wrinkled suit immediately sprang to his feet, clutching the hat tightly against his chest. "Mr. Santoro, I'm only asking for 3 minutes. My old shop down by the harbor. If you'll let me open it again, I swear I'll..." Rafe didn't stop walking. He passed the man without looking up from the papers and gave him only 3 words. "Monday. See Ezra." Then he disappeared behind the study door. The man stood frozen for half a heartbeat, then bent forward at the waist, bowing deeply toward the closed door as though he'd just been granted a mercy so great he still couldn't believe it. He put his hat back on, his hands trembling, and walked out into the night with the gait of a man who had just been given his life back. Nell stood motionless with the bucket in her hands, and for the first time, she truly understood the house she had entered. At Ravenscliff, a man could sit and wait through an entire evening in exchange for 3 spoken words. Other people's time had no value, only one man's did. Nell's room was on the attic floor, where the ceiling sloped so low that she had to duck her head every time she passed the left corner. There was a narrow single bed, a slim wooden wardrobe, a small window overlooking the bay, and a table lamp that cast a dull yellow glow. She sat on the edge of the bed, took off her shoes, and only then allowed herself to feel the deep ache running along her arm. She did as Mrs. Kroll had told her, wrapping a few ice cubes in a washcloth and pressing them against her wrist, counting silently until the cold seeped into her skin and flesh. Then she reached behind her neck, unclasped the silver necklace, and laid it in her palm. The pendant was oval, no larger than a coin, the silver tarnished by time and by the sweat of too many working days. She took the dry corner of the cloth and polished it slowly, one small circle at a time, the way she did every night without having to think about it. Her thumb moved along the edge of the pendant and stopped. There was a thin scratch there, running along the rim of the metal, about half the length of her fingernail. She couldn't remember when it had appeared. Maybe it had struck the side of a sink. Maybe she'd dropped it one day and forgotten. She wiped over it once more, then stopped, and thought no further about it. Her father had placed it in her hand the last time they saw each other, on the front steps of their old house, beneath a light rain that both of them pretended wasn't there. He had closed her fingers around it and said something she still didn't understand. Even now, keep this. Don't give it to anyone. Not even me. Nell put the necklace back around her neck, tucked the pendant beneath her clothes, then took out her phone. The screen lit up, and a little boy's face filled the entire frame, so close that she could see only one eye and his nose. Nell, look. Look at this. I'm looking, but all I can see is your nostril. Toby burst out laughing, moved farther back, and held up a gray plastic seal with a white belly. Auntie bought it for me at the shop near the church. His name is Captain Peanut Butter. That's a very long name, but he's a captain. Nell, captains have to have long names. The boy laughed, revealing the gap where his front teeth had recently fallen out, and his shoulders shook with the force of it. I lost another tooth. See? I put it under my pillow. Do you think anyone will take it? I'm absolutely sure someone will. Auntie said I have to go to bed early, but I told her I had to wait for you to call first. Nell leaned back against the cold wall, and somehow the pain in her wrist seemed to disappear. Well, now you can go to sleep. Not yet. You haven't told me about work. She was silent for exactly 1 beat, such a short beat that a 7-year-old boy could never have noticed it. It's very nice here. The house is huge, and there's even a garden overlooking the ocean. Everyone treats me kindly. Do you get good food? Really good. The chef here cooks even better than Auntie. I'm telling her you said that. Don't, please. Toby collapsed into laughter, hugging the plastic seal to his chest. Then he went quiet for a while, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. When are you coming home? Soon. I promise. You promised, okay? You can't break it. I never break a promise to you. After the screen went dark, Nell sat motionless in the darkness for a long time, still holding the phone after it had gone cold in her hand. Then she got up and went downstairs to the kitchen for some water. All the kitchen lights had been turned off, leaving only the glow spilling in from the hallway. On the steel work table in the center of the kitchen sat a bowl of soup that was still steaming, with 2 slices of bread beside it and a spoon placed neatly alongside. There was no note. Nell looked around, and at the far end of the hallway she saw the back of Agnes Doyle as the older woman walked toward the servants' stairs, her apron already removed and draped over one arm. She didn't turn around. She didn't say anything. She simply reached out, switched off the last remaining light, and disappeared into the darkness. The summons came in the middle of the next morning, while Nell was folding table linens in the laundry room. Mrs. Kroll appeared in the doorway without knocking, and said only one thing, that Mr. Santoro wanted to see her in the study, right now. Nell set the stack of linens down. She caught something passing across the head housekeeper's face, something close to pity but not quite enough to name, and that alone made her stomach turn cold. In this house, no one was called to the study for anything good. She took off her apron, smoothed the front of her dress, pulled her sleeves as low as they would go, and climbed the back staircase. The servants' stairs, narrow and dark, each step making a different sound beneath her feet. She passed through the thickly carpeted hallway, past black and white photographs of the old harbor, and stopped in front of the oak door she dusted every morning but had never once crossed. She thought about the cardboard box Mrs. Kroll had mentioned the night before. She thought about the hospital bills, about Toby's laughter through the phone screen, about the promise she'd made less than a day ago. Then she knocked. Inside, the study was larger than she'd imagined, and darker than she'd imagined. The curtains had been drawn back halfway, and winter light from the bay spilled into the room, cold and white. Rafe Santoro stood by the window with his back to her, one hand in his trouser pocket. There was nothing on his desk except a lamp, a closed notebook, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. He didn't turn around at once. He let her stand there, and Nell realized that this man's silence carried a weight of its own, like the air before a storm. "Sit down. I'm all right standing, sir." He turned. His eyes were dark brown, and he looked at her the way a man accustomed to reading financial statements might look at a face. "Sit." She lowered herself onto the edge of the leather chair. He remained standing. He walked to the desk, rested one hand on the back of a chair, and let the silence stretch a little longer. "How's your wrist?" Nell hadn't expected that question. She clasped her hands tightly in her lap. "I'm fine, sir. I didn't ask if you're fine. I asked how your wrist is." She swallowed. "It's only a little bruised, sir. I'm clumsy. I'm not used to carrying trays. And last night I caught myself on the edge of a table." He nodded slowly, a nod that carried no agreement at all. "The edge of a table." "Yes, sir." "Which table?" "I don't remember exactly, sir." "A table edge left 5 round marks on the inside of your wrist." Nell said nothing. She felt his gaze settle on her sleeve, and she understood that he'd seen everything before she'd ever stepped into this room. She waited for him to force her to say it. She had prepared 2 other answers, both of them lies, and she'd already decided which order she would use them in. But he didn't force her. He simply watched her for a few more seconds, then pulled out the chair and sat down across from her. And when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something calmer. "Mrs. Kroll says you're good at your work. She rarely says that about anyone." "I try, sir." "She also says you don't ask questions. You're not curious. You don't gossip. You don't ask who anyone is." He turned the cold coffee cup slightly beneath his fingers. "That's a rare quality in this house." Nell couldn't tell whether it was a compliment or a warning. She chose silence. "Starting next week, you'll be responsible for the study wing and the east corridor. Cleaning, replacing the flowers, keeping the keys. Mrs. Kroll will show you what to do." She looked up. "Sir, I thought you'd called me in here to fire you." "Yes, sir. If I wanted to fire you, I wouldn't have needed to see you." He said it so casually that it took her a moment to understand what he meant. "Go back to work." Nell stood, gave a small bow of her head, and walked toward the door. Her hand was already on the handle. She had turned it halfway. "Thank you, Miss Whitaker." Her hand froze on the brass knob. On the application she'd submitted to the cleaning company, on the transfer papers that had brought her to Ravenscliff, on every payroll form and every piece of paperwork, she'd never written that surname down. Not once. She stood completely still for half a breath. Then she opened the door, stepped into the hallway, and closed it behind her without looking back. The keys to the study wing were heavier than Nell had expected. 7 keys hanging from a brass ring, and Mrs. Kroll handed them to her on Monday morning with only one instruction. If there were people in the room while she cleaned, she was to keep cleaning. Don't ask, don't look, don't listen. The negotiation began after lunch. Nell carried in a tray of coffee, set it down on the side table against the wall, then stepped back to the exact place Mrs. Kroll had shown her, 3 paces from the conference table, her hands folded in front of her. No one looked at her. No one greeted her. In that room, she was no different from the desk lamp or the vase of white roses on the windowsill, something present to serve and absent from existence. Rafe sat at the head of the table in a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, 3 open files spread in front of him. To his right sat Ezra Callahan in a charcoal turtleneck. He didn't say a word throughout the meeting, only occasionally writing a line in a worn paper notebook with a frayed spine. Across from them sat an elderly man whose hair had gone almost completely silver, wearing a navy suit that had been carefully pressed, but was old enough for the wear along the collar to show clearly. His name was Harold Pruitt, the owner of a small freight company with 4 trucks and a leased warehouse south of the harbor. He had sat with his back straight the entire time, both hands resting flat on the table, and Nell realized he kept them there to hide the fact that they were trembling. "I know last quarter's numbers weren't good," he said. "I'm not hiding that. But I've hauled freight for your port since your father was sitting where you're sitting now. I've never delivered a shipment late. I've never lost a single crate. Rafe turned a page in the file without looking up. I know. I'm only asking for another 2 quarters. My wife is sick, Mr. Santoro. I had to take several weeks off to get her to treatment, and during those weeks I lost 2 secondary contracts. I'm not asking you for money. I'm only asking for more time. Nell stood still, her eyes lowered to the toes of her shoes, and she could feel the entire room waiting. For some reason she couldn't explain. She had thought the answer would be yes. Rafe closed the file. He didn't raise his voice. Nell would understand this much more clearly later, that this man never shouted, and the more displeased he became, the quieter his voice grew, until the whole room had to hold its breath just to hear what he was saying. Mr. Pruitt, warehouse rent in the South District has risen by nearly 1/3 since fall. 3 of your 4 trucks are overdue for inspection, which means you'll be paying for replacements next quarter. You're carrying bank debt at compound interest. If I give you another 2 quarters, then 2 quarters from now, you'll be sitting in that same chair asking me for 2 more. Except by then you'll lose the house you've put up as collateral too. The numbers don't add up, and I'm not helping you by pretending they do. The old man opened his mouth. But if you give me— Rafe stood up. Mr. Pruitt was still in the middle of the sentence, and Rafe rose before he had finished it, sliding the file toward Ezra. Ezra will work out the liquidation so you can keep your house. That's the best I can do. Then he walked toward the door. Mr. Pruitt remained seated for several more seconds, both hands still resting on the tabletop, and Nell watched his fingers slowly close into fists, then loosen again. He stood, buttoned his suit jacket, thanked Ezra in a perfectly ordinary voice, and walked out. He passed within less than an arm's length of where Nell stood. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at her at all, and she understood that it wasn't because he looked down on her, but because in that moment, to him, she didn't exist, just as he himself had ceased to exist only moments before. The door closed. Ezra gathered the papers and left as well. Nell stepped toward the table, picked up the coffee pot, and poured more into Rafe's cup, which still sat there even though no one remained in the chair. Her hand didn't tremble at all. She had carried trays through much larger parties. She had stood beneath far worse eyes. But when she set the coffee pot down, she realized that something in the way she thought about the man who had just walked out of the room had changed completely. He wasn't cruel. He hadn't raised his voice. He simply saw the numbers, and the numbers decided who stayed and who had to go. And Nell understood that if one day she became a number in one of his files, then the kindness he'd shown her that morning wouldn't save her. The servants' lunch at Ravenscliff was always held in the downstairs kitchen, around the long steel table in the center of the room, where Agnes Doyle ruled with a wooden ladle and a rough Irish voice. That day she had made potato soup with bacon and a tray of cornbread fresh from the oven. Owen Brady, the 24-year-old temporary server who studied law at night, sat at the corner of the table with his textbook open beside his plate. Nell had just sat down when the kitchen door opened, and Rafe Santoro walked in. The entire kitchen immediately rose to its feet. Owen nearly knocked over his chair. Everybody sit down. He said it, but no one sat. He walked straight to the steel table, pulled a plate toward himself, and served himself soup with Agnes's own ladle. Then he stood there with one hip resting against the edge of the table, eating on his feet like a laborer stealing a few minutes in the middle of a shift. In the doorway, Mrs. Kroll stood frozen with a stack of linens in her arms, and Nell noticed that more clearly than anything else in the room, because in the 2 months she'd been there, she'd never once seen the woman allow any emotion to show on her face. Better than last week. Agnes gave a grunt. I was out of onions last week. My mother used to make this too. He said it without looking at anyone. She once stood in a kitchen like this, in a house that didn't belong to her, before she married my father. She never talked about those years without lowering her voice. Then he went on eating, and no one dared ask another question. The door opened again. Ezra Callahan came in wearing his charcoal turtleneck, his paper notebook tucked beneath one arm as usual. He nodded to Agnes, accepted a slice of cornbread, and stepped back into a corner of the room to eat in silence. Nell noticed that he never put the notebook down on the table, not even while he ate. Then a loud laugh came from the hallway, the kind of laugh that belonged to a man who knew every door in the house would open for him. Bruno Santoro entered with a shearling coat thrown over one shoulder, 2 heavy gold rings on his fingers, and the scent of his cologne arriving half a step before he did. There he is. My nephew having lunch in the kitchen with the servants. He embraced Rafe, kissed him on both cheeks, and slapped him hard on the back twice. If my brother were still alive, he'd faint. You're early. I came to see whether you've come to your senses yet. Bruno picked up a slice of cornbread, took a bite, and spoke while chewing. and Nell realized that he was deliberately talking loudly enough for the whole kitchen to hear. Do you know what people are saying out there? They're saying the Santoro boy is about to turn the harbor into an accounting firm. Ledgers, permits, taxes, lawyers. Your father built all of this with his hands, and you're planning to hand it over to computers. Rafe set down his spoon. He didn't answer at once. He only looked at his uncle, and his voice grew quieter. My father died because he trusted the wrong person, uncle, not because he didn't have enough hands. Bruno burst out laughing, loud and hollow, then slapped his nephew on the shoulder again. Right, you're right. He turned to Agnes, praised the soup, asked about her knees, and left the kitchen with the same noise he'd brought into it. It took a while for the air in the room to settle back into what it had been. Rafe finished eating, put his plate in the sink like everyone else, and walked out. Ezra followed him. Once everyone had drifted away, Nell stayed behind to wash dishes with Agnes. Steam from the hot water clouded the small window. Where are you from, Nell? Quincy, ma'am. Quincy. So your family is still there, are they? Only my aunt and my younger brother, ma'am. Your brother? How old is he? 7. Agnes nodded, still scrubbing the pot. And your parents? Nell picked up a plate, rinsed it, and placed it on the rack. My parents are gone, ma'am. I'm sorry. It's all right, ma'am. Agnes was quiet for a moment, then asked in the same perfectly ordinary voice, the voice of an older woman simply curious about the life of the young woman standing beside her. What did your father do, Nell? Nell's hands stopped for exactly one beat, so brief that even she wasn't sure she'd stopped at all. My father was an accountant, ma'am. An accountant. Agnes nodded, finished scrubbing the pot, and didn't ask another question. The celebration for the harbor deal was held at the end of that week, and this time Ravenscliff opened all 3 of its southern rooms. Nell wasn't assigned to the ballroom. Her duty was the east corridor, the passage that led toward the study wing, where invited guests went to smoke cigars and discuss the things they didn't say in a crowd. Her job was to carry trays back and forth, keep the side tables full, and never look anyone in the face. She had managed that for 2 full hours. The hallway lights had been turned low, the thick carpet swallowed every footstep, and by the time the music from the ballroom reached this part of the house, it had faded into a muffled sound, like a party taking place in another home entirely. She was heading back with a tray that was nearly empty when Teddy Vane stepped out from around the corner and planted himself in the middle of the passage. He stood almost a head taller than she did, his blonde hair combed back, the top button of his evening jacket undone, and in one hand he held a glass of liquor that was already more than half empty. Nell stopped and moved to the right to let him pass. He moved with her and blocked the way again. You've been avoiding me all evening. Please let me through, sir. He didn't move. He braced one hand against the wall to her left, then the other against the wall to her right, the glass still caught between his fingers, and Nell backed away until her shoulders touched the wallpaper. The hallway was empty. She could hear laughter drifting from the ballroom, distant and blurred, only about 30 paces away, and an entire world apart. I asked the housekeeper your name. She wouldn't tell me. He leaned a little closer. I hate it when people hide little things like that from me. You're blocking me from doing my work. I'm not doing anything to you. He smiled, and Nell realized that the most frightening thing wasn't the smile. It was that he truly believed what he'd just said. To a man like this, a girl in a gray uniform wasn't a person with boundaries. She was part of the room, like the side table, the vase, the curtain. Touching her was as natural as laying a hand on the arm of a chair. Nell drew in a breath, then extended the arm holding the tray, pressed it against his chest, and stepped out from between the walls. She made it 3 steps. His hand seized her shoulder from behind and yanked her backward. She turned halfway with the force of it, the tray tipping, and as she spun, his fingers caught the silver chain at her throat. There was a very small sound, so small that no one who wasn't standing right there would have heard it. The chain snapped. The pendant flew free, struck the wooden floor, bounced once, bounced a second time, then slid and came to rest less than half a handspan from his shoe. Nell dropped the tray. She didn't think about it. She didn't hear it hit the carpet. Through everything that had happened to her since the year her life had collapsed, she'd never allowed herself to panic. She had stood still while people searched the pockets of her apron. She had knelt to gather broken glass in a room full of people. She had lied to her younger brother through a phone screen, without letting her voice tremble. But when she saw the last thing her father had left her, lying on the wooden floor beneath the foot of a stranger, something inside her broke loose, and she lunged down. He was faster. He didn't understand why she was reacting that way. He only thought it was amusing, and he placed the toe of his leather shoe over the pendant and pressed down. Oh, is this important? Nell looked up. She was on one knee, one hand braced against the floor, and for the first time all evening, She looked directly into his face. "Take your foot off it." "What did you say?" "Please, take your foot off it." He tilted his head as though considering the request, then slowly twisted the toe of his shoe against the metal. There was a faint scrape of silver against wood. "See, isn't it easier when you ask nicely?" "Say it again. Say it properly. Then I'll lift my foot." Nell didn't move. She looked down at the polished black shoe crushing the only thing she had left of her father. The thing he'd placed in her hand beneath the light rain on the steps of their old house. The thing he'd told her never to give to anyone. And in that moment, everything she'd learned about surviving, everything Mrs. Kroll had told her about how the people below were never right. Every calculation involving hospital bills and the promise she'd made to a 7-year-old boy, all of it receded into the distance and fell silent. Nell didn't say a word. With her left hand, she seized the rim of the silver tray lying tilted on the carpet, and in the same motion, she swung it sideways and slammed it hard into his shin. The sound of metal striking bone was dry and brief. Teddy Vane spat out a curse, his foot lifting instinctively, and that was all she needed. Her hand shot down, her fingers closed around the pendant, and she sprang to her feet, stepped back, and pressed her clenched fist tightly against her chest. Then he slapped her. There was no scream. No one called out. There was only a single sound in the hallway, sharp and clean, disappearing almost at once into the thick carpet. And then there was silence. Nell staggered to the left, her shoulder striking the wall, and she stayed there. One shoulder braced against the wallpaper, her eyes lowered to the wooden floor, her ears ringing. The music from the ballroom was still drifting toward them, steady and uninterrupted. Somewhere beyond that wall, 40 people were still raising their glasses and laughing, and not one of them had heard a thing. Teddy Vane bent down and rubbed his shin, his face reddening, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had just been hurt by a piece of furniture in his own house. "Are you insane?" Nell didn't answer. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" She still didn't answer. He straightened, adjusted his collar, glanced around the empty hallway, and something in her silence made him change his mind. He gave a contemptuous grunt, picked up his spilled glass, and walked back toward the ballroom, limping slightly for the first 2 steps. Nell remained where she was until the sound of his footsteps had disappeared completely. Then she slowly opened her hand. The pendant lay there, the silver tarnished, the broken chain hanging loose from one side, and its lid had sprung partly open. The toe of his shoe had pressed down too hard, or the impact against the wooden floor had damaged the tiny clasp, or both. Nell stared at it, and in that opening no wider than a hair, she saw something she had never seen in all the years she'd worn it around her neck. There was no photograph inside. There was nothing inside at all, only a hollow compartment. And at the bottom of it, the flat edge of something metallic caught the dull yellow light from the wall lamp. She froze, her breath stopping halfway in her chest. Then she heard a door open somewhere behind her. She snapped the pendant shut, so quickly that her knuckles turned white, and clenched it tightly in her palm. She looked up. At the far end of the hallway, near the turn that led toward the secondary kitchen, Owen Brady was standing there. He was wearing his serving vest, one hand still holding a cloth for polishing glasses, while the other held his phone at chest height. The hand holding the phone was trembling so badly that she could see it from across the hall. They looked at each other over the length of the corridor. Owen lowered the phone, shoved it quickly into his vest pocket, and opened his mouth as though he were about to say something. "Miss Whitaker, go back to your post, Owen, but go back." He stood there for another moment, his face pale, then turned and walked away quickly. Nell remained alone in the hallway. She lifted her other hand to her cheek and held it there, and she kept it there for a long time, far longer than necessary, staring straight at the wall across from her without seeing anything at all. Then she lowered her hand. She slipped the broken silver chain and the pendant into her apron pocket, pushed them deep into the bottom, and fastened the pocket button. She bent down, picked up the silver tray, set the unbroken glasses upright again, gathered the 2 that had fallen over, and used a cloth to blot the spilled liquor from the carpet. She smoothed her hair, straightened her collar, and drew in one long breath. Toby's surgery was still many months of wages away. She had calculated that number so many times that she knew it by heart, and it hadn't changed because of anything that had just happened in this hallway. Nell carried the tray toward the ballroom. She pushed through the double doors, and the music, the laughter, and the light from the crystal chandeliers came rushing at her all at once. She moved among the evening jackets and long gowns, stopped at the first table, filled 3 glasses, nodded, and continued on. No one asked why one side of her face was darker than the other. No one noticed that the silver chain was no longer around her neck. In that room, she was still the desk lamp, still the vase, still part of the room itself. And she kept pouring drinks that way until the last guest went home. Owen Brady stood in the secondary kitchen for perhaps 10 breaths, one hand still gripping the phone inside his vest pocket, while every reason not to do anything ran through his mind. He was only a temporary employee. He still had 3 semesters left before finishing law school, and he needed every dollar he earned. The man out there carried the name Vane. Owen had stood back many times in his life, and each time had been easier than the one before. Then he thought about the way she had picked up the tray and walked back into the party as though nothing had happened, and he ran. He ran down the service corridor, up the back stairs, and pounded on the study door hard enough to hurt his knuckles. When Rafe opened it, Owen told him everything in a single breath, without organizing the story, without holding anything back. Rafe found Nell in the secondary kitchen after the last guest had gone home. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the leg of the steel table, both knees drawn up, the silver tray lying beside her. Agnes was crouched in front of her, pressing a cloth-wrapped ice pack against her cheek. No one said anything. Rafe stood in the doorway and looked in. He looked at the ice pack, at her collar, at the bare place around her neck where a silver chain had always been before. Then he turned away. He walked back down the hallway, opened both ballroom doors, and stepped into the middle of the people who were still lingering there. The musicians were still playing. He crossed the room without moving aside for anyone, without asking anyone to let him pass, walked straight to the piano, and slammed the lid shut with one hand. The crack of wood against wood carried through the entire room. The music stopped. Glasses lowered. Everyone turned toward him. And for several seconds, no one seemed to know what to do with their hands. Mr. Vane. Teddy Vane was standing near the window with a drink in his hand, and he turned around with the same smile still on his face. "What's this about, Rafe?" Rafe walked toward him. He stopped about an arm's length away, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet that the people behind them had to lean forward to hear. "There's one rule in this house. You don't need to know who owns it. You don't need to know how I make my living. You only need to know one thing." He paused. No one in the room moved. "Your hands belong to you. Another person's body belongs to them. No amount of money buys that boundary. And tonight, you crossed it in my house." Teddy's smile twisted. "Over a maid?" Rafe didn't answer that. He turned away from him, looked across the room, and began calling names. He called the name of the gray-haired man standing beside the fireplace, the chairman of a regional bank. He called the name of the woman in the green velvet gown, the director of a marine insurance company. He called 2 more names near the door, one a lawyer and the other a harbor real estate broker. He spoke each name clearly, one at a time, and added nothing afterward. No one asked what he meant. Every one of them understood. By the next morning, every line of credit in Theodore Vane's name had been frozen. 3 of his appointments had been canceled before lunch, and his name had disappeared from the guest lists of 4 other houses in the city before nightfall. But that belonged to the next day. That night, Rafe went back to the secondary kitchen. He took off the black wool coat he was wearing and placed it around Nell's shoulders. She looked up, about to say something. "Can you stand?" "Yes, sir." He held out his hand. She looked at it for a moment, then braced her own hand against the floor and stood by herself. He didn't insist. He only walked beside her, slowing his pace to match hers, and led her out of the secondary kitchen. Nell thought they were going toward the servants' stairs. Instead, he turned left, walked down the main hallway, through the ballroom where the last guests were collecting their coats, and went straight to the front hall. He opened the great oak door, the door reserved for guests, the door she had never been allowed to walk through since the first day she came to that house. He held it open and stepped aside, waiting for her to go first. At the foot of the staircase, Bernadette Kroll stood motionless with a stack of linens in her arms, and as Nell passed, the woman raised one hand to cover her mouth. That night, in the small room beneath the attic roof, Nell sat for a long time with the coat across her lap. The wool was heavy and warm, still carrying the scent of the man who had worn it. She took it down to the laundry room, washed it clean, dried it, then pressed every seam carefully, as though it were formal clothing meant for a ceremony. She folded it into a neat square so she could return it the next morning. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at it for a while longer. In the end, she opened the narrow wooden wardrobe, hung the black wool coat on the only empty hanger beside her 2 gray uniforms, and closed the door. Nell believed it was over. For the next 3 days, the house moved according to its usual rhythm, and she worked as she always did, pulling her sleeves down, avoiding mirrors, never mentioning that night to anyone. Then one afternoon, someone rang the front doorbell and handed Mrs. Kroll an envelope addressed to her. Inside was a summons. Ezra Callahan was the one who read it to her in the study, his voice level, one line at a time. and he read slowly enough for her to understand every word. Theodore Vane had filed a civil lawsuit and a criminal complaint, both directed at her, both submitted before anyone had managed to file anything against him. In the documents, he claimed that he had been standing in the hallway speaking politely with a member of the serving staff when she struck him in the leg with a metal tray, causing a soft tissue injury that required treatment. He had a medical certificate from a private clinic in Beacon Hill. He had 2 witnesses who said they saw him limping away from the East Corridor, and he had something worse than all of that. The Vane family lawyers had attached a 4-page statement describing what they called her unstable psychological condition after her father's death. It included the name of the clinic she'd visited exactly twice during the first weeks after the funeral, when she couldn't sleep and her aunt had forced her to go. It included the fact that she'd abruptly left her previous job, interpreted as quitting without cause. It included the 3 times she'd changed residences within a single year, interpreted as evidence of an unstable life. Not one line in those 4 pages was an outright lie. Every piece of it was true, only arranged in a different order, and that order painted the portrait of a young woman who had lost her father, deteriorated afterward, become emotionally volatile, and attacked a guest at a party. Nell lowered the papers onto the desk, but Owen recorded what happened. He was filming from the far end of the hallway. The light was poor, and he started recording after everything had already begun. Ezra closed his notebook. The footage shows the 2 of you standing close together. It shows you swinging the tray first, and it shows the rest in about 2.5 seconds, that a good lawyer can explain any way he wants. The other side has already seen it. They filed after they watched it. The door opened. Rafe came in, and Nell knew immediately that he'd known before she did. "Give us the room, Ezra." When the 2 of them were alone, Rafe walked to the window and stood there for a while before turning back. "I had my lawyer review the file this morning. So what are you going to do, sir?" "Nothing." Nell looked up. "Listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once, and I'm not going to make it easier to hear." He pulled out a chair and sat across from her, both elbows resting on his knees. "If I step into this case, the first thing the other side does won't be to withdraw the complaint. The first thing they'll do is ask why the owner of this house is spending money to protect a maid. Then they'll seek a discovery order. Then they'll start opening my books, and my books contain pages I can't allow anyone to open. Not because of me, but because there are names in there that would pull hundreds of other people down with them." Nell sat motionless. "I can buy an entire building before lunch. I can have someone's license taken away before the end of an afternoon, but I can't buy testimony in a courtroom, and I can't stand beside you in that courtroom. If I stand beside you, I'll become the heaviest thing dragging you down." That was what Nell hadn't expected. Not the meaning of his words, but the way he said them. In the 2 months she'd lived in this house, she'd watched that man decide other people's futures with a few numbers. Watched a silver-haired old man walk out of a meeting room with trembling hands. Watched an entire room hold its breath whenever his voice grew quieter. And now, for the first time, she saw him sitting there, unable to do anything. "So I have to handle it myself." "No. You'll have the best lawyer money can hire, and no one will ever trace who paid him." He stood. "But the testimony has to come from you, and you'll have to stand in front of a room full of people and tell them, from the beginning, everything that happened in that hallway." It began with a file Rafe had left behind on the study desk. Nell noticed it when she went in to clean, a gray folder with the name of a law firm printed in one corner, and she remembered that he'd mentioned it during their conversation that afternoon. She asked Mrs. Kroll about it, and the woman said Mr. Santoro had left earlier that day, and probably wouldn't return until morning. Nell could have simply left the file where it was, but something had changed inside her during that week. She no longer wanted to sit quietly and wait for other people to decide what would happen to her. She borrowed the gardener's old pickup truck, asked Owen for the address, and drove down to the North Harbor after darkness had fully settled in. The North Harbor in winter was a place without color. Rows of shipping containers were stacked into steel walls 3 stories high, with narrow lanes of standing water between them, and the high-pressure lamps poured down a pale yellow light that made everything look like an old photograph. Nell parked outside, walked in through an open-side gate, with the file pressed against her chest, intending only to hand it to someone and leave. She heard voices before she saw anyone. She turned into a narrow passage between 2 rows of containers, and at the far end was an open space, illuminated by the headlights of a vehicle. A small steel table stood there, the kind used by dock workers. Rafe was standing beside it. Ezra stood half a step behind him, his notebook tucked beneath one arm. Across from them was a man around 40 years old, wearing a wool coat, his hands bare in the cold air, standing straight even though his shoulders had already begun to sag. Nell stopped. She pressed herself into the gap between two containers, and she didn't understand why she didn't turn away. I don't need you to explain. Rafe's voice carried clearly through the cold air, and it was so calm that he might have been discussing a delivery schedule. I've already read it. 3 shipments moved through the south gate, all on nights when you were on duty. I know how much you took, and I know who paid you. Mr. Santoro, I swear. Don't swear. I hate that. Rafe placed a ticket on the steel table, white paper printed in black ink, and pushed it toward the other man with 2 fingers. A flight to Phoenix. One way. It leaves before dawn. Then he placed a thick envelope beside it, and pushed that across as well. There's enough in there for you to rent a place and live for a few months. You have a wife and a daughter. I haven't forgotten that. The man looked down at the 2 things on the table without daring to touch them. And if I stay? Rafe was silent for a beat. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter. You have until tomorrow morning to leave the East Coast. After tomorrow morning, I don't owe you kindness anymore. There was no shouting. No one stepped forward. No one raised a hand. There was only the sound of wind moving between the 2 walls of steel and water dripping somewhere high above them. The man remained there for several more seconds, then picked up the ticket and the envelope, slipped them into the inside pocket of his coat, and said thank you in a voice so hoarse it was barely a sound. He walked away, crossed through the beam of the headlights, and disappeared into the darkness. Ezra took out his notebook, opened to a page, and drew a line through one entry. He closed it, slipped it back inside his coat, and said nothing. Nell stepped backward. Her heel struck an empty metal drum propped against the side of a container, and it fell over. The sound of metal rolling across concrete rang through the silence, long and sharp, impossible to hide. Rafe turned his head. He looked directly into the dark gap where she was standing. He didn't call her name. He didn't walk toward her. He simply stood there beneath the sickly yellow light from the headlights and looked in her direction. And Nell understood that he'd recognized her from the very first second. They looked at each other through the darkness, separated by perhaps 20 paces, and something that couldn't be measured in footsteps. Then he turned away, said something to Ezra, and the 2 of them walked toward the vehicle. Nell remained where she was long after the headlights had gone dark, and the sound of the engine had faded into the distance. Her arms were still wrapped around the file against her chest, and she realized she was trembling, though not from the cold. For the past 2 months, she'd believed she understood that man. She had watched him slam the piano lid shut to defend her. She had watched him place his coat around her shoulders and open the front door for her to walk through. She had sat across from him and heard him admit that he was powerless. And now she had seen the rest of him. The part the house overlooking the bay had always hidden behind its crystal chandeliers, and for the first time, she was truly afraid of him. But what kept her rooted between those 2 steel walls on that winter night wasn't fear. It was the realization, clear and impossible to deny, that even after knowing all of this, she still didn't want to leave. He summoned her to the study the following morning, earlier than the usual cleaning hour, while mist still hung over the bay, and no one in the house was awake yet. Nell had prepared an apology. She had arranged it in her mind all night, 1 sentence at a time, and she'd even accounted for the possibility that he might dismiss her on the spot. But when she walked in, there was no file on the desk, no cup of coffee. There was only a paper notebook with a frayed spine, closed and placed directly in the center. She recognized it immediately. It was the notebook Ezra Callahan never set down on a table, not even while he ate. He let you borrow it, sir? He works for me. Rafe pulled the notebook toward her, opened it to a page already marked with a slip of paper, and turned it around. Read the 4th line. The edges of the page had yellowed with age. Ezra's handwriting was small and square, written in blue ink, each line containing a name followed by several abbreviations she didn't understand. The 4th line contained only 1 word, Whitaker. Nell stared at it for a long time. She felt the surface of the desk grow cold beneath her palms. When was this written? Before you came to this house. He closed the notebook. Before you submitted your application to the cleaning company. She looked up. My father died in an accident on the Beltway, one night in late fall. He never regained consciousness. But before the ambulance arrived, he managed to say a few things to Ezra, and Ezra wrote down every word, because that's what he's done for 40 years. Rafe rested his hand on the notebook's cover. The last thing my father said was a name. He told Ezra to find Whitaker. He didn't say who Whitaker was. He didn't say why we were supposed to find him. He only said the name, and then nothing else. Nell sat motionless. It took us a long time to learn who he meant. Then we found out. The chief accountant for the Ashford Vane Fund, forced out of the company, framed as an embezzler, killed in a car accident on a rainy night, and the case closed 9 days later. We searched for everything he left behind. There was nothing. The house had been cleared out, the computer seized, the accounts closed. He paused. Only one daughter remained. Nell could hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Ezra was the one who put your file on my desk. The cleaning company you worked for is on our contractor list. Transferring one employee to Ravenscliff took exactly one phone call. He looked directly at her. You didn't find your way into this house, Miss Whitaker. You were invited in. The silence stretched so long that Nell could hear the fireplace ticking inside the wall. For the past 2 months, she'd believed she was the one doing the calculating. She'd thought she'd been clever to take a job in a place frequented by the people she wanted to find. She'd believed her invisibility was a weapon. And now she sat there realizing that from the very first day, she'd walked directly into a place someone else had prepared for her. What do you want from me? Anything your father left behind. And if I don't have anything, then you would have been gone by the second week. He said it calmly, and then he said something that chilled her more deeply than anything else she'd heard. During your first week, while you were downstairs working the afternoon shift, someone entered your room. They checked the wardrobe, the lining of your suitcase, the backs of the drawers. They didn't take anything. And they put everything back exactly as it was. They found nothing. Nell thought of the small attic room, the narrow wooden wardrobe. All the nights she'd sat on the edge of that bed believing those 4 walls were the only thing in the world that still belonged to her, because it wasn't in the room. She lifted a hand to her throat, where there was nothing now, and she saw his eyes follow the movement. Right? How long have you known? I wasn't certain. I only noticed that you never took it off. Not even when you washed dishes. Nell stood. She walked into the middle of the room, then stopped with her back to him, both hands clenched tight. Then that night, when you slammed the piano lid shut. Nell, the night you put your coat around my shoulders and walked me out through the front door in front of all of them. She turned to face him. How long were you playing that part? From the beginning? Or only from the moment you knew for certain that what you wanted was hanging around my neck? Rafe didn't answer. He opened his mouth, and nothing came out. He sat there with both hands resting on the notebook, belonging to the man who had written down his father's final words. And for the first time since the day she entered that house, Nell saw him unable to find a single thing to say, because he no longer knew the answer himself. Nell didn't return to the study for the rest of that day. She finished her entire shift, ate lunch in the kitchen without saying a word. And when the whole house had gone dark, she climbed to the attic floor, locked her door, and took the pendant from the bottom of her apron pocket. She sat beneath the table lamp, placed it in her palm, and looked at it for a long time before doing anything. Then she slipped a fingernail into the narrow seam along the edge, where the thin scratch ran, the same scratch she'd polished over hundreds of times, without ever once wondering about it. And she pried the lid open. There was no photograph inside. There was a shallow, hollow compartment, and fitted tightly into that space was a small, flat steel key, shorter than the first joint of her little finger. It was the kind of key she'd seen hundreds of times during the years when she worked in the financial district, the kind made for one purpose and one purpose only. She lifted it out, and beneath it, engraved by hand directly into the silver, was a row of numbers. The cuts were shallow and uneven, the sort of numerals made by a man who had spent his entire life working with figures. Nell set both things on the table and sat motionless. She thought about the steps of the old house, about the light rain they had both pretended wasn't there, about the way her father had closed her fingers around the pendant and told her not to give it to anyone, not even him. All those years, she'd believed it had been nothing more than a strange thing said by a tired man. Now she understood that it hadn't been strange at all. It had been a father who already knew he wasn't coming back. A father who had calculated everything so that what he was hiding wouldn't be left anywhere people would think to search. They had cleared out the house. They had taken the computer, closed the accounts, even searched the lining of her suitcase without her ever knowing. And through all those days, the thing they wanted had been hanging around her neck, traveling with her through 3 different homes, through night shifts, through even the night she'd knelt on the marble floor of a stranger's house. She covered her face with both hands, and remained that way for a long time. The bank stood in the financial district, a gray stone building with heavy brass doors that Nell had once walked past every morning in her old life. She wore the only coat she still owned that looked respectable, brought her identification and her father's death certificate, and prepared herself to be turned away. But the clerk only looked at the numbers, typed a few keys, then stood and asked her to follow him. The room in the basement was cold and silent, its walls covered with rows of small numbered steel doors. The clerk inserted the bank's key, Nell inserted hers, and the 2 keys turned together. He pulled out the box, placed it on the table in the middle of the room, then politely stepped outside and closed the door behind him. Nell stood alone before the long steel box. She opened the lid. The first thing inside was a thick stack of papers held together with 3 metal clips. And the moment she saw the first page, she knew what she was holding. These were the original ledgers. Not printouts from a system, not copies. Handwritten pages mixed with photocopied reconciliation sheets, all dated, all signed, with notes written in the margins in her father's own handwriting. She turned several pages and saw the name Ashford Vane Fund repeated again and again at the top of each table. She set the documents down, both hands trembling. The second item was a roll of photographic film inside a round gray plastic canister, undeveloped film. Nell picked it up, turned it once in her fingers, and found no label, no notation, nothing at all. She placed it beside the ledger papers and thought no further about it. The third item lay at the very bottom. It was an old photograph, yellowing at the corners. She lifted it and held it beneath the light. In the picture, 2 men stood side by side on a pier, with cranes and stacks of shipping containers behind them, sunlight falling diagonally from the left. The man on the right was her father. He was much younger than the last image she carried of him, his hair still dark, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and he was smiling, truly smiling, the kind of smile she hadn't seen on his face during the final years. The man on the left stood half a head taller, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair, one arm draped around her father's shoulders, and he was smiling too. Nell stared at that face, and she felt the floor beneath her tilt. She had walked past that face every morning for 2 months. It hung in a black and white photograph in the second-floor hallway at Ravenscliff, along the passage leading to the study, and she had dusted the glass so many times that she knew the tiny crack in one corner of the frame by heart. It was Rafe Santoro's father. Those 2 men had known each other. Not known each other in the way businessmen met across conference tables. They stood shoulder to shoulder on a sunlit pier, smiling at each other like friends. Nell rented a room by the week in Dorchester, paid in cash, and stayed there for 3 nights. She told Mrs. Kroll that her aunt was sick. The room had a folding table and a ceiling light, and she spread the entire set of ledgers across the table, dividing the papers into groups and fastening them with clips she'd bought at the grocery store down the street. She hadn't done this kind of work since the year everything fell apart, and for the first half of that first day, the numbers drifted past her eyes like a language she'd once known and somehow forgotten. Then, by afternoon, it came back to her. Her father kept records the old-fashioned way, the method he'd taught her when she was still a girl sitting at the dinner table doing homework. Every suspicious entry was marked with a small dot in the left margin, every reconciliation with 2 diagonal strokes. She followed those dots the way someone might follow footprints through snow. The money began with 3 small freight companies in New Jersey, whose names she'd never heard, moved through a marine insurance brokerage in Providence, then flowed into an investment fund called Ashford Vane as institutional investor capital. Once there, it was mixed together, divided, redistributed, and sent out the other side as clean profits that could be reported for tax purposes. Nell had seen structures like this in training courses. She had never seen one documented in such detail by someone sitting at the very heart of it. By the second night, she found the signatures. Every transfer order required an authorization signature from the contributing side, and her father had photocopied every single one, arranged them chronologically, and clipped them into a separate group. Nell turned through the pages one by one, and the same signature appeared again, and again, and again. It wasn't the signature of the salt and pepper-haired man in the photograph. Not once. Every document carried a different signature, written large, slanting sharply to the right, with a long hooked stroke beneath the final letter. Bruno Santoro. She sat up straight in the plastic chair and stared at the paper beneath the ceiling light. In the final group of documents, there was something different. It wasn't a table or a financial statement, but a handwritten page in her father's handwriting, written more hastily than the others. It contained notes about 3 meetings. The person he'd met wasn't identified by a full name, only by 2 initials, but on the final line of the page, perhaps because he was tired or because he'd stopped thinking about the need for secrecy, her father had written one name in full, Santoro, and beside it, in parentheses, he had added 4 words, the older brother, not the younger. Nell read that line over and over, until her vision blurred. The salt and pepper-haired man had discovered what was moving beneath his family's name. He hadn't gone to the police. He hadn't gone to the newspapers. He had gone to a chief accountant in the financial district, the only man in that entire system willing to record the truth in his own handwriting. They had met 3 times. After the 3rd meeting, one man died on the Beltway one night in late fall. A few weeks later, the other died on a rain-slick road and the case was closed after 9 days. The entire city had called them 2 accidents. Nell returned to Ravenscliff the following afternoon. She didn't change into her uniform. She went straight to the study, knocked, and when Rafe opened the door, she walked in and placed the entire set of ledgers on his desk. "Read the 4th group first." Rafe looked at her, then sat down and opened it. He read very slowly. He didn't ask a single question. Nell stood on the other side of the desk with her arms at her sides, watching his face the entire time. When he reached the group of signatures, he stopped for a long time on the first page. Then he continued, turning one sheet after another, going through the entire set without skipping a single one, all the way to the last. When he reached the handwritten page, he read it twice. Then he closed the file, placed both hands on the cover, and sat in silence. "Aren't you going to say anything?" "I know what my uncle signed." Nell hadn't expected that answer. "I've known since last year. I didn't know who my father went to. I didn't know why he died. I didn't know what the name in Ezra's notebook meant, but I knew whose signature that was." He looked up at her. "Are you going to do anything about it?" "I already have. I sold part of my stake in the casino. I've taken 3 freight routes out of his control. I'm moving the entire harbor operation into a new corporate entity, slowly, because if I do it too quickly, 200 people will lose their jobs in a single week. And the money from all the years before that?" Rafe was silent for a while. "Nell, I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm clean." He rose, walked to the window, and looked out over the gray bay. "I grew up in this house. I went to private school with that money. My dental work was paid for with that money. Summer camp was paid for with that money. I was sent to Europe for a summer when I was 16 with that money. I ate at that table throughout my entire childhood, without ever asking where the money came from." He turned back to look at her. "I can give back a great many things, but I can't give that back. And you have every right not to forgive me for it." What caught Nell's attention was the pickup truck. She had borrowed it from the gardener the night she went down to the North Harbor, and she had asked Owen for the address, and aside from those 2 people, no one knew where she'd gone. Yet the next morning, the moment she walked into the kitchen, Agnes had asked whether the roads had been slippery the night before. At the time, Nell had taken it for an ordinary question from an older woman. Now, as she sat back and began putting one thing after another together, she started counting. The person who knew she was from Quincy. The person who knew she had a 7-year-old brother. The person who knew her father had been an accountant. The person who knew she'd been gone for 3 nights and had said her aunt was sick. The person who asked those questions in the voice of someone scrubbing a pot. Nell said nothing to Rafe. She went down to the kitchen late one afternoon, when Agnes was the only one left there, kneading dough on the steel work table, both hands and wrists dusted white with flour. "Mrs. Doyle." "Nell, how much does Bruno Santoro pay you?" The hands pressing into the dough stopped. Agnes didn't look up. She stood there with her back slightly bent, and the kitchen became so quiet that Nell could hear a pot of water bubbling softly on the stove behind them. "He doesn't pay me a cent." "Then what does he use?" Agnes slowly pulled her hands out of the dough and stared at them as though they belonged to someone else. "Colm, my sister's boy. His father left when he was 3. His mother died 4 winters ago, and I'm the only person he has left." She swallowed. "He owes money to a place on Broadway. He's been gambling since he was 19, and I've paid his debts twice already. Every dollar I had saved. The 3rd time, I had nothing left, and he came to you. He didn't come looking for me. He just stood in the kitchen doorway one morning, complimented my baking, asked about my knees the way he always does. Then he said he'd heard Colm was having trouble." Agnes looked up, and her eyes were red. "He said he could make it disappear. He said he didn't need anything in return. Only wanted to hear from time to time if anything new was happening in the house. Who came, who left, what his nephew was doing. Little things, Nell. The first thing I ever told him was that Mr. Santoro had changed law firms. That was all. I thought, what harm could something like that do?" Nell stood still. "Then the next time, he asked about you, and you told him." "I did." Agnes raised the back of her hand to wipe her eyes, leaving a white streak of flour across her cheek. "I told him you were from Quincy. I told him you had a little brother. I told him your father had been an accountant. I told him you'd been gone for 3 days. Her voice broke on the last word. "I knew it was wrong. I knew from the 2nd time. But by then I was already in it. And if I stopped, Colm." She couldn't finish. She braced both hands on the edge of the steel table, lowered her head, and her shoulders began to shake. "The night you called your brother. The night I left that bowl of soup on this table." She kept speaking without looking up. "I stood right here with the phone in my hand for nearly an hour. I dialed the number, then erased it. I dialed it again, then erased it. I could hear you laughing with that little boy upstairs, and I thought about Colm, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do anymore. She let out a long, trembling breath. I ladled out that bowl of soup because I didn't know what else to do. Then I turned off the light, and the next morning I called him. Nell stood on the other side of the steel table, looking at the 61-year-old woman bent over the half-kneaded dough, and she thought about many things at once. She thought about the 4 pages the Vane family lawyers had filed about her. Every word of them true, every truth rearranged into a shape meant to destroy a person. She thought about Mrs. Kroll and the rule she'd lived by for 30 years. She thought about herself, about the lies she'd told a 7-year-old boy through a phone screen, and about what she would do if someone put Toby on the other side of the scale. Nell walked around the end of the table. She reached out, placed her hand over Agnes's flour-covered hand, and held it there. "Look at me." Agnes raised her head, her face wet and blurred with tears, the white streak of flour still across her cheek. "You're not a bad person. You're just someone whose weak spot they knew how to find." Nell gently tightened her hand around hers. "I'm not angry with you, but I need you to help me with something, and this time you have to tell me everything." He was waiting for her in the small west sitting room on a Thursday morning, and the first thing Nell noticed was that he'd already had someone prepare 2 cups of tea. Bruno Santoro sat in the floral-upholstered armchair, his shearling coat draped over one arm of the chair, the 2 heavy gold rings on his fingers gleaming in the winter light from the window. He stood when she entered, pulled out a chair for her, and did it with complete ease, like an uncle welcoming his niece home for a visit. "Sit down, Nell. I brought this tea from a place I know. It's much better than the stuff they buy at the market. I'm still on my shift, sir. Mrs. Kroll knows. I already spoke to her." Nell sat on the edge of the chair. He poured her tea first, then poured his own, moving slowly and carefully, without spilling a single drop into the saucer. "I hear you're a very good worker. Mrs. Kroll is famously hard to please, and even she speaks well of you." "I only do the work I'm given, sir. That's what I admire about young people." He set his cup down. Then he reached for the leather briefcase beside his chair, opened it, and took out a stack of papers clipped inside a blue cover. He placed it on the low table between them, turned it around so she could read it, and gently pushed it toward her with 2 fingers. Nell looked down. The first page was a cost summary from a children's hospital south of the city. The patient's name was printed in the upper left corner. Beneath it was a list of charges, from the room fee and monitoring costs to the entire estimated cost of the surgery she'd calculated so many times over the past year that she knew the number by heart. And in the final column, across from every single line, there was the same word, paid. She turned to the second page. It was a guardian information form, and on it was her aunt's full name, the address of the house in Quincy, the landline number, and even the name of Toby's elementary school listed under emergency contact information. Not a single detail was wrong. Nell placed one hand on the edge of the table. "Who did this, sir?" "I did." Bruno lifted his tea and blew gently across the surface. "I heard you'd been worried about it for a long time. That's a heavy thing for a young woman to carry. I have the means to take care of it, so I did. That's all. I've never told anyone in this house about that." "Nell," he smiled kindly, and took a sip of tea. "I've lived in this city longer than you've been alive. There's nothing in this city I have to ask about before I know it." Then he set his cup down, looked out the window, and shifted into an entirely casual tone. "Does it feel colder this morning than it did yesterday? They're saying we'll have snow this weekend." "I don't think so. The wind is still coming from the south, and as long as the wind is coming from the south, we won't get snow." He went on talking about the previous winter, about how the road down to the harbor had frozen over, about how he'd had to replace his tires twice. He talked for nearly 10 minutes, relaxed and cheerful, occasionally chuckling to himself. Nell sat there listening, and she felt her hands growing colder and colder, the chill creeping inward from the tips of her fingers. Not one threat had been spoken. Not one sentence could be recorded and carried into a courtroom. There was only a stack of papers on the table, and an old man talking about the direction of the wind. When he stood, he gave the back of her hand a single light pat. "Keep those papers. They're yours." Nell left the west sitting room and walked straight ahead. She didn't stop at the kitchen. She didn't go up to the attic. She went directly to the study and opened the door without knocking. Rafe was standing beside the desk with Ezra. He looked at her face, then at the papers in her hand, and he didn't ask a single question. He only turned to Ezra and said 3 words. "This afternoon." Now. By the end of that afternoon, Toby had been transferred to a children's hospital in the western suburbs, a low building surrounded by broad lawns, and he liked it immediately. His new room was twice the size of the old one, with 2 large windows looking directly onto a garden with stone benches and several bare maple trees. And in the afternoon, the sunlight reached all the way to the foot of his bed. He had a small cabinet of his own where he could keep his toys. There was a nurse named Marguerite who knew how to play tic-tac-toe and lost to him 3 games in a row. When Nell video called him that evening, Toby spun the phone around the entire room so she could see everything, held his plastic seal up in front of the window, and announced that Captain Peanut Butter liked this place better than the old one too. The boy asked why he'd been moved. Nell told him this hospital was better. That was all. And he believed her, because to a 7-year-old child, that was a perfectly reasonable answer. The news came from Agnes. She called Bruno the way she always did, and said exactly what Nell had told her to say, that the ledgers were still in the old funds safe at the North Harbor Archive, and that no one had moved them yet. When she finished, she set the phone down on the steel table, and both her hands were shaking so badly that Nell had to hold them. Ezra looked at the clock on the wall and said that if Bruno believed her, they would come tonight. He believed her. The Ashford Vein Fund Archive was housed in a row of low buildings behind the North Harbor, a windowless concrete structure that was cold and dry inside, with long rows of steel filing cabinets beneath fluorescent lights. Nell knew this place. She had worked here in her old life, had come down to retrieve reconciliation documents on late afternoons at the end of each quarter, had cursed the cabinet in the 3rd row because it always jammed and had to be lifted slightly before it would open. Rafe didn't want her to come with them. He said it twice. Nell asked him only one question in return. Which of the men standing in that room had ever held a key to that warehouse? And no one could answer. They arrived first. Ezra switched off every light in the archive, left the rolling door locked from the inside, and 4 of Rafe's men spread out between the rows of cabinets. Nell stood farthest back, close to the wall, holding a flashlight she didn't turn on. They waited in the darkness for nearly an hour, and during that time Nell could hear water dripping from a pipe overhead, steady and slow, one drop after another. Then came the sound of an engine. Headlights swept across the narrow gap beneath the rolling door, brightened, then disappeared. Footsteps crossed the wet concrete outside. More than 2 people. Metal scraped against the lock, grinding patiently, followed by a dry snap. The rolling door was raised halfway, and the yellow light from the high lamps outside spilled in, cutting the room into long bands. 3 men ducked underneath and came inside. The first was carrying a pry bar. Ezra switched on the lights. Every fluorescent fixture overhead flared to life at once, and for the first 2 seconds no one moved. All 3 intruders stood frozen, hands raised to shield their eyes. Then the man with the pry bar charged forward. Everything that followed happened quickly and cleanly. Rafe's men stepped out from both sides of the filing rows, and Nell barely had time to see an arm rise to block, a body turn, the pry bar knocked free, and sent skidding across the concrete with a sharp metallic screech before it came to rest beneath the 2nd row of cabinets. The man was forced face down onto the floor, his wrist pinned in a firm lock, and he stopped struggling. The 2nd man turned and ran for the door, only to be stopped at the opening beneath the rolling door. The 3rd man didn't run. He remained exactly where he was, both hands raised to shoulder height, and beneath the white fluorescent light Nell saw his face. She recognized him immediately, the gray suit wrinkled at the elbows, the felt hat he'd turned over and over between his hands through an entire evening in the Ravenscliff foyer while waiting for 3 words. Rafe recognized him too. He walked over, stopped in front of the man, and said nothing for a long moment. The shop by the harbor. Mr. Santoro, you sat in my house for an entire evening asking me to let you reopen it. Rafe's voice was very quiet. And my uncle had already promised it to you before that, hadn't he? All you needed was a permit with my name on it, so the shipments could pass through without anyone asking questions. The man lowered his head and didn't answer. Ezra took out his notebook, wrote a line, then closed it again. Outside, a vehicle engine suddenly started, followed by the sound of it backing away hard, tires squealing over the wet concrete. 2 of Rafe's men ran out, but the taillights had already vanished behind the rows of containers, and the engine noise faded toward the highway until it disappeared completely. Bruno Santoro had been waiting outside, and he'd never intended to step inside at all. Rafe stood looking out at the empty yard. He'll be out of the state before morning. Nell didn't hear him. She had already turned away and was walking between the rows of filing cabinets. She passed the 1st row, then the 2nd, and stopped at the 3rd. She placed her hand against the cold steel, found the 4th drawer from the bottom, lifted it slightly before pulling, exactly the way she'd done hundreds of times on late quarter afternoons in another life. The drawer slid open smoothly. Inside were reconciliation files arranged by quarter, and all the way at the back, behind a cardboard divider no one would have thought to remove, was a flat archive box covered in dust. Nell pulled it out and opened the lid. Mr. Santoro. The entire room turned toward her. She stood there beneath the fluorescent lights with the archive box open in her hands, and inside were the complete originals of everything her father had photocopied. Every page, each one bearing receipt stamps, signatures, and dates. Not copies. Originals. The roll of film had been lying in the desk drawer of the Dorchester room ever since the day Nell opened the safe deposit box, and she'd almost forgotten about it. She remembered it one morning while packing her things, picked up the round gray plastic canister, and turned it in her hand. She took it to an old photography shop in the South End, where the owner was over 70 and still kept a darkroom in the back. He held the film up beneath a light, said no one used that kind anymore, and told her to come back in 2 days. 2 days later, he handed her a thick paper envelope. Be careful with these. Somebody took them without being seen. Nell opened the envelope right there on the sidewalk. There were 11 photographs, all slightly blurred, all taken from a distance and from somewhere high above, probably from inside a vehicle parked on the sloping road overlooking the harbor. The framing was crooked. Part of one photograph had been cut off, and another had sunlight flaring across one corner, but all 11 showed the same scene. A table had been set outside a small restaurant by the docks, with 4 people seated around it. Nell turned through the photographs one by one beneath the daylight. The man sitting with his back to the camera had broad shoulders and rings on his hand, and she recognized him immediately, even without seeing his face. In the last 2 photographs, he turned partly to the right to speak, and the younger face of Bruno Santoro appeared clearly enough to show every crease around his mouth. She didn't recognize the other 2 men. The 4th person sat on the left side of the table, slightly apart from the others, not participating in the conversation. She was a young woman with dark hair pinned neatly back, wearing a gray coat, with an open notebook and a pen in front of her. She was bent over, taking notes. Nell stared at that photograph for a long time. She held it farther away, then brought it close again. She studied the way the woman sat, her back straight, both shoulders held in the same fixed posture, her chin slightly lowered. Nell had seen that posture every day for the past 3 months, at the head of the steel table in the downstairs kitchen, at the foot of the staircase, in the doorway of the laundry room. 20 winters younger, without a single strand of silver in her hair, but unmistakably the same woman, Bernadette Kroll. Nell returned to Ravenscliffe and found her in the 2nd floor linen room, where she still inspected tablecloths every Tuesday afternoon. Nell closed the door behind her, walked over, and placed the photograph on top of the stack of white linens in front of her. Mrs. Kroll looked down. She said nothing. She reached out one hand, touched the edge of the photograph, then drew her hand back. Where did you get this? My father took it, with Mr. Santoro's father. Mrs. Kroll stood motionless for a long time. Then she pulled out the wooden chair from the corner of the room and sat down slowly, like someone who had just walked a very long distance. She pointed to the chair opposite her, and Nell sat. I came to work for this family when I was 24, not as a housekeeper. I was the family's secretary. I took minutes at meetings, typed correspondence, kept the schedule. I studied accounting for 1 year and had to quit because I ran out of money, and they hired me because I could take shorthand quickly. She looked down at the photograph. I was sent to that meeting to take the minutes. I sat right there, and I wrote down every word. What did you write? I wrote down the names of 3 companies in New Jersey. I wrote down the amounts. I wrote down who would sign and who wasn't supposed to know. She looked up. That evening, I typed the minutes in duplicate, the way I always did. The next morning, they called me upstairs and told me that meeting had never happened. They took both copies. They took my shorthand notebook too. She rested both hands in her lap. 3 weeks later, I was promoted to housekeeper. My salary doubled. I was given a private room. No one explained anything, and I didn't ask. Nell said nothing. Then his older brother died. Then I heard that an accountant in the financial district had died too, and I understood that I hadn't been promoted because I was good at my job. Her voice was very calm, and that calmness made the words heavier than anything else could have. I've lived in this house for 30 years with what I knew. I've eaten here, slept here, grown old here. And every time I saw someone treated unfairly in this house, I was always the first person to rush over and tell them to stay quiet, because silence was the only thing I knew how to do. She looked directly at Nell. That night in the ballroom, I was the one who stepped up and held your shoulder down, telling you to stay quiet. Yes, I still remember. I remember it very clearly. Bernadette Kroll stood. She picked up the photograph with both hands, looked at it one more time, then handed it back to Nell. I remember the names of all 4 people sitting at that table. I remember the date. I remember every number in those minutes, because I typed them twice. She drew in a breath. Take me to your lawyer. I'll testify. and I'll testify in court if they make me stand there and do it." Nell knocked on the study door that evening with everything in her hands. She placed the original ledgers from the archive on the desk, her father's notes, the 11 photographs inside the paper envelope, and the 6-page handwritten statement Mrs. Kroll had spent the entire afternoon writing in the linen room. Rafe looked at the stack of documents and didn't reach out to touch it. "Read it. I already know what's in there." "No, you don't know all of it." She opened the file to the exact section she'd marked and turned it toward him. "My father recorded the money that went to your branch too. You didn't sign for it, but it flowed into entities that are now in your name. If I give this to the prosecutors, they won't stop with your uncle." Rafe sat down. He pulled the papers toward himself and began to read, truly read, page by page, in a silence that lasted nearly an hour. Nell stood by the window and looked out over the dark bay. "I could remove this section," she spoke when he finally closed it. "If I take out these 17 pages, the rest is still enough to shut down the Ashford Vane Fund, and still enough to arrest your uncle. No one would ever know those pages existed." Rafe looked up at her. "Then why don't you?" "Because my father didn't." She turned to face him. He could have stayed quiet and kept his job. He had 2 children to support that year, and one of them couldn't even walk yet. He still wrote everything down. He didn't leave anyone out, not even the friend who trusted him. She placed both hands on the edge of the desk. "I'm not making this decision for you. These are your records. This is your house. This is your family. What you do tonight is your choice." She straightened. "But tomorrow morning, I'm still turning all of it over, intact." Then she left the room. The next morning, Rafe Santoro went to the United States Attorney's office on Sudbury Street with his lawyer and a leather briefcase, and he didn't wait for anyone to summon him. He arrived before Nell did. He disclosed the flow of family money going back 2 generations, the corporate entities, the foreign accounts his father had opened, and that Rafe hadn't yet managed to close. He gave them the name of his own uncle, every signature, and all 3 companies in New Jersey. He surrendered every asset whose lawful source couldn't be established, signed documents transferring 2 casinos and a freight company to a court-appointed trustee, and agreed to cooperate fully throughout the investigation. The plea agreement was signed several weeks later. He received a suspended sentence with a lengthy probation period, was placed under financial supervision, permanently lost the right to hold any business license connected to gambling operations, and was ordered to pay a fine so large that Ravenscliffe had to be mortgaged. People asked him why he hadn't run while he still had time. He only said that there were some things you couldn't outrun, and prison wouldn't erase them either. But at the very least, when everything was over, he wanted to be standing on the right side of the table. Bruno Santoro was arrested at a rest stop on the road to Canada, less than an hour's drive from the border. Agnes Doyle's testimony was what allowed the arrest warrant to be signed 3 days earlier than expected, because she was the only person who could prove that he had personally gathered information about a witness. She told them everything, including her own part in it, and she did so without asking for anything in return. Rafe paid off all of Colm's debt to the gambling house on Broadway Street on one condition, that Colm complete the full 6-month gambling addiction treatment program at a center in Worcester. He went, and he stayed. Theodore Vane was charged with 2 offenses: securities fraud and assault. His countersuit was dismissed. The video Owen Brady had recorded with his trembling phone from the end of the hallway, the same video a good lawyer had once said could be interpreted any way they wanted, became something entirely different when placed beside Mrs. Kroll's testimony about what she'd witnessed that night, and Nell's own testimony in court. Owen took the stand on a Wednesday morning wearing the only suit he owned, and his hands didn't tremble at all. The man in the wrinkled gray suit pleaded guilty to aiding the transport of undeclared goods and received a reduced sentence for cooperating, and the harbor shop never reopened. But the thing Nell had been waiting for wasn't contained in any sentence or judgment. It came one spring morning, on the business page of the city's largest newspaper, in the form of a short article no longer than 400 words. It stated that following the conclusion of the investigation, the embezzlement allegations against Arthur Whitaker, former chief accountant of the Ashford Vane Fund, had been determined to be entirely without foundation, and that he had in fact been the first person to report the wrongdoing. Nell read the article 3 times while sitting on the front steps of the suburban hospital beneath the sunlight, and she didn't cry until she reached the final line. The first snow of the season fell on a Saturday morning, covering the lawn behind the house with a thin white layer just deep enough to hold footprints. Toby was the first one outside, his boots rising almost to his knees, the second loop of his scarf slipping loose without him bothering to fix it, and his laughter carried across the entire yard. His surgery had been completed at the beginning of fall, and the doctors had said that by summer he would be able to run like any other child his age. The boy didn't wait for summer. He ran around the bare maple tree 3 times, lost his breath, dropped heavily onto the snow, then got back up and started running again. "Uncle Rafe, give me a piggyback ride. I just gave you one. That was round 1. This is round 2. Rafe bent down, and the boy climbed onto his back, wrapping both arms around his neck, and Rafe carried him all the way around the lawn, while Nell stood on the steps watching, both hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. When they came back, Toby slid down, dug into his coat pocket, and pulled out a sheet of paper, folded into quarters. "I drew this in class. My teacher told us to draw our home." Rafe unfolded the paper. On it was a large gray house drawn in crayon, with a pointed roof and many windows, and above it were white dots falling across the entire sky. In front of the house stood 4 people in a row, holding hands. One was tall and dressed in black. One had long hair. One was the smallest, and was holding a gray animal with a white belly. And one had white hair, and was the roundest of them all, standing at the end of the row. Beneath them, the boy had written in uneven capital letters, "This is my home." Rafe held the drawing for a long time. He opened his mouth once, then stopped. He folded it carefully along the same creases, and slipped it into the inside pocket over the left side of his chest. "Is it pretty, Uncle Rafe?" "It's beautiful." That was all he could manage to say. Agnes called everyone inside for breakfast, standing in the kitchen doorway, and wiping her hands on her apron. She had returned to work after the trial ended, not because anyone had asked for mercy on her behalf, but because she had stepped forward on her own and testified to everything she had done, and the court had taken that into account. Ravenscliffe was smaller now. Half the rooms had been closed, the guest house had been sold, and the remaining staff could be counted on one hand. Nell had returned to her old profession in the spring, working for a small auditing firm in the financial district, sitting at the desk farthest out beside the window, earning the salary of someone beginning again from the very start. Every month, she set aside a portion of her pay and put it toward the hospital expenses Rafe had advanced for Toby's surgery. He had told her she didn't need to. She had told him she needed to. She had promised herself she would repay every last dollar, and he never brought it up again. Mrs. Kroll had retired and moved into a small apartment in Somerville, and once a month she came back for dinner. Owen Brady had graduated and was spending his first year at a legal aid office, defending people who couldn't afford to hire anyone else. That evening, after the house had gone dark and everyone had gone upstairs, Nell stood washing dishes in the downstairs kitchen. Rafe came in, rolled up his sleeves, and took his place to her right with a towel in his hands. They worked in silence for a while, she washing, he drying, one plate after another. Then he set down the towel, reached into his pocket, took something out, and showed it to her in the palm of his hand. The silver pendant had been polished again, the clasp repaired, and threaded through it was a new silver chain, strong and unmarked. "When did you take it?" "Last week." "You didn't notice." Nell dried her hands on her apron. She turned her back to him, lifted her hair away from her neck, and stood there. Rafe slipped the chain around her neck, brought both hands forward, and fastened the clasp. He did it slowly, and his fingers were awkward in the way of a man who had never needed to ask anyone's permission for anything in his life, and was now learning how from the beginning. When he finished, he didn't pull his hands away immediately. He left them resting there on her shoulders, and she let them stay. On the kitchen wall above the sink hung a small wooden sign Rafe had carved himself one afternoon in the fall. The lettering was uneven, and the final word was slightly cramped, but the message was perfectly clear. In this house, no one is touched without permission. Nell Whitaker's story didn't end with the guilty being made to pay, although they did pay. It ended with something much simpler. A person's dignity isn't something granted by others. It doesn't live in the uniform they wear or in the amount of money they earn each month, and no one has the right to take it away. People diminish someone not because that person is lesser, but because they believe there is no one standing behind them. And in a crowded room, the guilty person isn't only the one who reaches out a hand. The guilty ones are also everyone who sees what is happening and chooses to look away. The lesson here is to be kind to someone before you know who they are, because kindness only has true value when it is given to someone who has no way to repay us. If this story made you stop for a moment in the middle of your day, please leave a like, share it with the person who came to mind as you listened, and subscribe to our channel so you can join us for new stories every day. How did Nell and Rafe's story make you feel? And if you had been in that room, what would you have done? Leave a few words in the comments below. We truly want to hear what is in your heart. Wishing you and your family good health, peace, and many joyful days ahead. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.